Hey, it's Nolan here. In today's video, I want to try forging out this little hunting knife.
The first thing I'll do is pick out a suitable steel. I want this to be an all-purpose knife, so the steel I'm going to use is an old ball bearing. These tend to have a high carbon content containing around 1 to 1.5% carbon. This will result in very high hardness and offer some good edge retention. The small piece I've found is already a perfect length, so we can throw it straight in the forge. I'm going to be running my forge on around 3 psi. This will make sure my steel gets to an appropriate forging temperature.
The temperature is very important when forging ball bearings. If you have the steel too hot, it can burn and split apart on you, while forging too cold can do the same by causing stress to build up and fracture the steel. You want to forge your steel around a bright cherry red color, and if you see your steel turn back into a gray, it'll be too cold and you'll risk cracking it, so it's best to play it safe and put it back in the fire. Here, I'm just trying to draw the material out as fast as possible, so I'm using a rounding hammer with some hard and not very precise blows. This will give me the width I need, but I'll have to go back and do a lot of smaller detail work later. Now I'm doing something called a preform. This basically means that I'm giving it a very rough shape before I draw it out more to make the intricate shaping easier later. This isn't as necessary in a small knife like this versus something bigger, like say a kitchen knife, but nonetheless, it's still great practice. Once I'm happy with my preform, I can go back through and continue to draw it out until I have the desired thickness. Now that I have it to the thickness that I want, I can start the fun part, forging the main shape of the knife. I usually start by forging the tip, then transitioning down the blade to the heel, which I'll explain more in a minute. When forging the tip, I use really light pressure and consistently rotate it to make sure it doesn't mushroom out on the sides. Once I'm happy with the profile of the tip, I'll move on to forging in the heel. This is a crucial step because it will also be the start of your bevels. Typically, you want the heel of your knife to be the thickest part, and to make sure I forge it evenly, I'll flip it consistently so one side doesn't get pushed over further than the other. It's also important to make sure you keep it centered with the spine of your knife. This will help keep your whole edge straight in the long run. Now that I've got the rough profile forged in, I'll go ahead and flip the knife around and begin working on the tang. This part is pretty straightforward. I'm just going to forge it on the material until it's thin enough to adjust the shape more easily. If you notice the round impressions left behind, it is because I'm using a hammer with a very round face, and this helps to push the material in all different directions. Now I'm just going to round over all the sharp corners. There's really no specific way I do this. I just kind of play around with it till it looks right. I like to use the sharp corners of my hammer to dig into the steel to allow me to get a smaller radius to further define the shape of the handle. You'll now notice this gave me a nice step up from the handle to the heel of the blade. I didn't quite get it to the nice round shape I wanted, so I'll use a hardy hole tool to help set in that choil. Once I got that to the shape I wanted, I'll now move up to the horn of my anvil to do practically the same thing, just on a larger scale. I accidentally squished it down a little too much, so I had to go back and hammer it from the sides quite a bit after to straighten it back out. But once I have it straightened back out, the only part left to forge will be just cleaning up the profile. This is one of my favorite parts in the forging process because it really pulls everything together and makes it look more like a complete knife. It's fun to watch as all the high spots get smoothed down and to see all the small pieces of scale pop off as it cools down. The very last thing I'll do before taking it into the garage is to use a wire brush to scrape off some of the scale to give it a smoother finish and to save some of the durability of my abrasives. Now that I've got it forged out to the best of my ability, I'll go ahead and put on the profile, and then I'll take it to the grinder and begin most of the stock removal. When grinding, I'm going to use a worn down 36 grit belt, and I'll apply different pressure to different areas to get as clean of a result as possible. Basically, I'm just going to slowly grind around the whole knife until my Sharpie lines disappear completely. Something I've been working on a little more recently is forging the complete shape of the knife, so I don't have to spend so much time at the grinder, and on this knife I sort of got close to the final product, so there wasn't a ton of grinding I had to do. Now that I'm done roughening the profile on the grinder and cleaning it up with files, we can go ahead and throw it back in the forge and begin the heat treating process. I'm going to be running the knife through 3 normalization cycles. This will relieve all the built-up stresses from forging and further refine the grain pattern. I'll start by bringing the knife up to critical temperature and then removing it from the forge to cool back down to around 800 degrees. And then I'll repeat this process 2 more times using slightly less heat each time. Once I'm done normalizing the knife, I'll bring it back up to around 1500 degrees and I'll go right in for the quench. After the quench, I went ahead and tempered the knife at 400 degrees for 2 hours. And then I'll test the hardness with a file. And the file was skating pretty good. So after that, I want to see if it could scratch glass. And it did that pretty easily, so I wanted to push it and really see what I could do. So I tried batoning it into some sheet steel. And I had never done that before, so it was pretty nerve-wracking. But to my surprise, there was 0 damage. After testing the edge of my knife a little bit, I drew on some markings to tell me how far up to grind the bevels. I didn't want to risk ruining a brand new belt on the hardened steel, so again I used a worn down 36 grit belt to do most of the work. After grinding in all the bevels, I can take some sandpaper and hand sand the blade to really refine the edge and take out any small imperfections left behind from the grinder. Hand sanding is probably mine and a lot of other makers' least favorite part of the process, but taking just a little bit of that extra time to do it can really set your work apart from the rest. And after hand sanding, I gave it a quick mirror polish, and I was really happy with how it came out. Now I can start working the handle. Right now I'm just marking some spots to tell me where to drill through. And I actually did my process a little backwards this time. Mostly because I got too excited to quench the blade, but typically you want to drill your holes before heat treating just so you don't risk trying to grind through hardened steel. The wood I'm using for this knife is sort of a mystery. I found a dead tree when I was walking through the woods one day, and it had this cool burl growing off of it. So I cut into it, and to my surprise, the wood was still incredibly hard and showed no sign of any rotted spots. So, I took it home and dried it out, and now we're here. If I had to guess, I would assume it was something like dark oak, but I'm not 100% sure. So if you have any ideas, please let me know down in the comments. This part here is arguably the most satisfying part of the whole process. Just watching the wood get eaten away is so oddly satisfying, yet sort of terrifying. This part is especially fun if you have a brand new belt that's still super sharp. It'll eat away the wood almost immediately. However, if you even think about touching metal to that belt, it'll all of a sudden just burn the wood and start to cut super slowly. So, if you want your belts to cut wood better, it's best to keep them separate from the rest. Or at least that's what I've found. It could just be me. After getting the wood to the same shape as the handle, I can go ahead and epoxy it. I use a 2-part epoxy, and I mix in just a little bit of sawdust to match the same color of the wood. I make sure to coat both sides of the knife and the sides of the wood that come in contact with the steel to make sure I don't get any gaps in the connection. Once all the pieces are in place, I clamp down a bunch of clamps and I let it sit overnight. The next day, I pop it out of the clamps and go back to the grinder. This time, I use a fairly new 60 grit belt to do most of the shaping. As I'm shaping the handle, I go back and forth, testing to see if it fits my hand well and to make sure it's as comfortable as possible. This part is tricky because you want a handle that's super comfortable, but also one that looks good. It's still super fun though to see it take shape and get closer to that finish line. I'll also use the top part of my grinder where there's a slack in the belt, and I'll quickly rotate it back and forth to get a nice, smooth, and even radius. And after all that, I'll take a rasp and go through and take down any hot spots and really make sure that the knife feels good as possible in the hand. Once I'm finally happy with how it feels in the hand, I'll begin the finishing process. I'll start at 240 grit sandpaper and I'll go through the grits to further smooth it out and get rid of all the larger scratch marks. I will then spend a good bit of time moving up the grits to ensure that all the previous scratch marks are gone. In the end, I think I ended up going to around 20,000 grit sandpaper. I don't usually do this, but I got new sandpaper recently, so I want to try it out. Typically, 5,000 grit or so is sufficient, but it did give it an extremely smooth finish on this wood, so I think I'll do it again in the future. My finishing process is fairly simple. I just rub on some mineral oil, and then I'll buff on some cutting board wax, but it does give me a finish I'm happy with. And if any of y'all out there have a finishing method you recommend, please leave it in the comments. I'm always looking for more ways to keep improving. After applying the finish to the knife, I let it key overnight, and then I sharpened the knife and spent a good bit of time getting some finishing shots. Then, it was done. If you made it all the way to the end of the video, I genuinely appreciate it, and I hope you enjoy the B-roll. God bless.